Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Moving on then. Well, okay, we're moving right on to forgiveness does not equal trust, which is kind of what we just talked about a little bit. And I do agree with her on a lot of her points here. This idea that just because I forgive or have empathy for somebody doesn't necessarily mean that now I'm back to trusting. And I can even have quite a bit of empathy and forgiveness through the process. But the process can include a lot of, like we've been talking about, behavioral modification, behavioral negotiation. We all know that most of us, I think, can understand the idea of having behaviors we want to change, but not necessarily having that happen overnight, right? So most of us have habits or things that we're trying to work on a regular basis. And so yeah, trust is different than forgiveness. Any further thoughts on this part?
I don't know if I have anything really to add, but I am having something come up for me where I just want to comment that I do talk with most couples, if not everybody, that love and forgiveness are not the same thing. Trust and forgiveness are not the same thing. And that we can parse those out and talk about them with different energy if we have different energy about them in our relationships. If we say we forgive someone, we cannot trust them for quite a while, and that's perfectly fine and probably healthy, certain things. And so I think for me, a lot of this is bringing up just how important it is to have the appropriate type of vocabulary and language around these things that most of us were not raised with. And so we're kind of stumbling upon newer, more healthy ways in our adulthood. And I think that deserves some patience.
Well, and I think what's coming up for me as Kristin's talking is just, I'm reading this part that she talks about betrayal trauma and PTSD and just how important it is for these couples to have support, not all of them, but many of them to have support around this view, especially if, they are really viewing it as a problematic sexual behavior or infidelity. It's so important for them to have a therapist who really understands how to treat this and help them move through the stages in order to get to those places of forgiveness and trust again. And I think that's something that can be really difficult to do on your own.
That's what I was thinking I was going to articulate, Shannon, was that there can be an active effort to rebuilding trust when you have that right support and guidance and help. And it may not just be a matter of time. It can also be, it can be very vulnerable and a risk to want to restore that trust, because there's a potential, especially if you have had experienced something and that you identify as a betrayal or a trauma, that can be opening yourself up to be hurt again, especially when, as she talks about, being, if this has been going on for a while in their marriage, having a pattern of trying to give back trust and having that broken, and giving back trust and having that be broken, that can be very, very vulnerable. And so that is important to parse out, and it is important to have support and to have the language so that they can rebuild and develop healthy expectations and start to develop what restoring trust can look like.
I agree.
Yeah, Kristin, I really appreciate your thoughts, and just some things that I would add, just as I've been thinking about this when I'm treating people, is even the difference between, again, in Mormonism, I think behavioral compliance is so important, and we place so much of our trust on behavioral compliance. And even shifting away from that sometimes can be really helpful. Not that you want to put up with any behavior, I'm not saying that, but as people are moving towards different behaviors, or as we start to accept some behaviors are just part of humanity, that trust can then take on a whole new meaning. And it doesn't have to be through this accountability model of how many times somebody has masturbated, or how many times somebody has had an inappropriate thought, or what would be deemed an inappropriate thought, or things of that nature, or even looking at certain materials. I've just seen a lot of couples work on the whole concept of trust from a very different paradigm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Is there anything that we want to complicate with this betrayal trauma, the way that is coined? It's not that there's a lot of things here that, yeah, when you are facing infidelity in a partner, the idea that you're going to shut down, have depression, despair, grief, I mean, absolutely, that I've seen that so much. I guess where I want to complicate it a little bit, and I don't know what you all think about this, but I do think that our narratives play a big role on how to respond. So in other words, if you've been told your whole life that if your partner looks at pornography, kind of like how you started, Kristin Hodson, that was a hard line for you. Well, why was it a hard line? I think that you were taught to see it that way because, if we teach our people pornography will ruin your marriage, pornography will mean this, it will mean that, if your partner's doing this, this is what it means. Well, then, yeah, you're going to have a huge reaction to that. That's, in a sense, that's how you've been taught to react. Because there's also the reality that outside of religious conservatism, there are people who are also equally upset with partners who look at pornography. And there are people who are not really that upset about it at all, right? And so I do think, I guess the reason I say I want to complicate it a little bit is because if you're in a war zone and a bomb drops, your religious values don't really matter as to the trauma that's going to be perceived on that. But a lot of times when it comes to sexuality, your religious values and the meanings that you attribute to these things can play a huge role in the type of trauma that you experience. Is that a fair way to put that?
Yeah, I think it is. And the narrative that you kind of tell yourself. I think, I don't know, Kristin, was that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The way you're describing, I'm 100%. The only narrative I knew about pornography was that it was, and the meaning, you hit that right on, was that you would never get better, that once you were an addict, you were always an addict, and that it would destroy your marriage. And that once you discovered that, really what you were discovering was just the tip of the iceberg, and that it would go on forevermore. And because one of my very first jobs was working with people that were addicted to pain pills and heroin, and there was a 5% recovery rate from that, or healing, or whatever you want to say. And so I overlaid that with pornography, and also had the narrative in my head of, well, you can not go into the bar, you can change your friends, but everyone's a sexual being. So pornography addiction actually is the worst, because there's no way out of that, period, end of story. That's what I was taught. That's what it meant. And that's why it was a very hard line to me, is it meant I was going to be discovering and setting myself up for a lifetime of betrayal, hurt, lies, you name it.
One thing I want to add to that, which is, I hope this comes across as hopeful as I hope it does. One of the ironies that I have, or I don't know, lovely little nuggets I have discovered over the years is that what's been interesting to see is that there have been a lot of couples that have actually experienced the exact opposite of that narrative. That yes, through disclosure or discovery or whatever, with a violation of the marital sexual contract, and how devastating that was, by working through it and staring it and really deconstructing it, not through the addiction kind of lens, but through a lens of values-based, relationship-based, integrity embracing lens and dignity defending lens, that it has brought them closer than they ever imagined they could be. So in essence, going through all of this did not destroy their marriage. It actually, by the way they chose to approach it, led them to a better place than they've ever experienced. So I'm not advocating violating a marital contract by any means, but I will just say I've seen plenty of evidence that the exact opposite happened.
And that is then the follow-up. That's exactly what we experienced once we got ourselves out of the sex addiction path it didn't mean that our therapy needed to end. Like I said, we discovered what needed to be addressed. And I wouldn't trade it for the world, because it cracked open authenticity, integrity, honesty, connection, everything that we wanted but didn't know how to get. And it was initially, it felt scary and a bit like a free fall, and was the best thing that ever happened to us.
Just
Pretty
thinking
incredible.
as you're saying that, Kristin, and both of you actually, both Kristins, of Esther Perel's TED Talk and the Rethinking Infidelity, and she discusses how after oftentimes of infidelity, these are sometimes the marriages are better after than they ever were before. And I think a huge piece of it is being able to look at that and be really open and honest with one another, and after you deal with kind of the crisis at hand, and being able to say, make sense of how did we get here, and what steps do we need to take in order to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Because I wouldn't want women or men to read this description of betrayal trauma and then have that inform how they respond if they're faced with something. That may be part of your experience and it may not be. And let's figure out what the right response is for your particular experience, or why you're experiencing, some of the betrayal that you're feeling. So plus I always am trying to be a little bit picky about diagnostic terms versus more cultural terms. So betrayal trauma is not going to be something you're diagnosed with. It's not a diagnosis. It's I think a description that's attempting to try to validate the experiences of people who are legitimately very hurt in a relationship. And definitely there can be anxiety manifestations of that, depression manifestations of that might become diagnosable over time. But at the same time, we do not diagnose or pathologize normal responses to grief. So for example, when somebody dies, you're not diagnosed with grief. That's a normal response. That's supposed to happen. You're supposed to be sad. You're supposed to be upset. So if you find out that your partner is acting in a way that you haven't contracted, that you're not aware of, that there's been secrecy, well, you're supposed to be upset about that. That's a normal thing to be upset about. And we just want to be careful not to pathologize or make something clinical that isn't.
Great point.
The last bullet point there that I'll agree with her on is, as a bishop, you can help by not giving the spouse a timeline for either forgiveness or trust. I would definitely agree with that. That's not the role of a bishop to be telling a spouse when they should be done with the forgiveness. Again, that's usually something that's best talked about in couples counseling. That's something I talk with my couples a lot, and understanding that actually there's usually not a timeline. There can be certain ways that you can say, okay, I'm at a point where I'm ready not to necessarily bring this up every time we have an argument, right? Or there can be a time when you decide maybe I can bury the hatchet per se in some ways in our relationship, but to have that be tied to somehow your worthiness or your ability to be seen as ecclesiastically okay, that I don't think that's appropriate at all.
I agree with you. I think that that's very individual, and I think people move at a different pace depending on their experience, and it's not something that anyone can really assign for them.
Okay, great. Number 5. Another common attitude from ecclesiastical leaders is to ask us to treat the addict like our child, asking, what would you do for your child? And I'm guessing this comes from this place of, we are all God's children. We all deserve love and compassion and opportunities, to tune into the atonement or have repentance be part of our life. And so I can see how this might be something that's said to a partner. In other words, well, why don't you treat your spouse like God would treat your spouse? And although there's something maybe abstractly helpful about that idea, it's not very helpful when you're legitimately angry and we're trying to place boundaries, or obviously to her point, your spouse isn't a child and you're going to have a very different relationship with behaviors your child is doing that you're not maybe okay with versus your partner. So any thoughts on this?
Well, I have a few thoughts on this one. this is just a no-win. I think it's kind of tough to parse out what exactly maybe she's meaning here, because by my understanding, and I would love to hear her respond to this, but it actually, up until this point, it actually kind of does frame the way to talk and treat and think about one's spouse that is kind of betrayed another spouse within the sexuality realm. It actually does kind of defend this hierarchy of, now there's one spouse that has the authority or the clearer mind, and they may or may not, but to frame it that way is just take any wind out of the sails of anyone who is trying to actually speak with their spouse and negotiate and communicate and include their spouse in this difficulty in their life, or what's perceived as a difficulty. And so,
like a parent-adolescent dynamic is what you're talking about, right? Up until now, everything has been a parent-adolescent dynamic. Yes, right.
So this kind of was a wee bit of a curveball for me, but I like it. I like that she's asking bishops to please not put one spouse in a parent role over their other spouse. I completely support that. I have a lot of clients who don't expect those three things from their spouse, and then I have a lot that do.
Exactly.
So it's really overgeneralized, but I do think.
So the sentence that you're talking about, just in case people haven't read it, is women.
Sorry.
She says, this is a complete misunderstanding of the husband-wife relationship. Women look to their spouses to do three basic things: provide, preside, and protect. Yeah, this is a whole nother podcast, really. This is a whole nother issue, right? But it is indicative to what we've been talking all along, that we do play very specific gender roles in our culture, our LDS culture, and therefore it does set up men to be the addict. It does set up women to be the victim, and she pretty much just wraps that up very nicely in these two sentences. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's the one thing that stands out for me: the provide, preside, and protect. I don't think every woman looks to. I agree with Kristin. Some do, some don't. It's too much of an overgeneralization.
And even within that generalization, I think there's issues with it where we expect, in a sense, a male spouse to then not be able to have any frailties or humanity weaknesses, because otherwise it would interfere with one of those three roles. It also keeps women from stepping up into those roles as well. So presiding automatically means there's non-equality in a relationship, which is problematic. Don't both spouses need protection, and the provide piece, that's a very individual couple type of issue, who's providing what. And there's all kinds of things we provide, not just finances. So yeah, lots of problems there. You can see how this also plays into that betrayal trauma piece, right? Because, oh my goodness, if my spouse is looking at material that would make him unworthy, then he no longer can play these roles in my life that not just affect me, but our children. I mean, it's very scary, if you're in that position where you're looking at it from that lens, it very much feeds into that fear, shame cycle for both of them, and lots of pressure, and you're really not helping a couple have intimacy together. You're just helping them play certain roles together. And that's problematic.
And Natasha, I'll take it maybe one step further. I have so much compassion for this situation, because, for the spouse who's engaging in behavior that's perceived as problematic or whatnot, we're not now just talking about a conflict in sexuality, a betrayal in the marital contract, which totally deserves attention and is legitimate. We're now talking about who they are as a man, who they are as these things that specifically within Mormon culture or across the board, really right now. That just took it to a whole different level of shame that can come up for a lot of people that are going through this.
I agree, Kristin. And I also, as you were talking, something else comes up for me. And I listened to the podcast before this, and she does mention, and it just made me think of something, but she mentions the policing that I think puts you into that parent-child dynamic. And It's the monitoring and the policing. I sometimes call it the detective phase with clients, but where you have the passwords to the computer and they can't access the computer anymore, and etc. I mean, it can just go on and on and on. And I think these are the things, Natasha, we already touched on a little bit, but where she touches on too about having someone help you set healthy boundaries and boundaries that work. And then at what point can we let go of some of these boundaries, but doing it as kind of a collective decision rather than this is what you have to do. So it's not so much of being in the parent-child role.
Yeah, which is so frustrating to the next point that she makes, because I'll just jump ahead. One of the pieces of advice she says is talk to the sisters, educate them on the signs to look for in their spouse and children. That is very much a monitor, and oftentimes I tease my couples by injecting humor by saying, nobody wants to be married to a parent, a teacher, or a missionary, right? And so,
or have sex with them, usually.
Yeah, or have
so
sex with them, right?
Further.
And that policing, that job that oftentimes women, I think, in the church feel responsible, that it's somehow, it is my responsibility to make sure that this isn't happening. Now, with your children, sure, that can be part of your responsibility as a parent, a joint responsibility to educate about pornography and have correct filters in your computers or whatever it is that you do in your home. But with your spouse, that is really not your job to be policing whether or not they're being truthful with you. They either are or they're not, and that's a whole nother topic to bring to your therapist, but it's not your job to police that. Kristin, are you wanting to say anything? Are you still there, Kristin, or did you pass out on your NyQuil?
Yeah, I'm here. I think you guys are saying wonderful things.
Okay, I just didn't know if you were there still. You don't have to pipe in. I'm just worried about your cognizant state. All right. Number 6, she talks about local church leaders can make a difference. I agree with this. I don't agree with necessarily her advice on how to. So
Correct.
She gives a lot of resources that I would disagree with and have a lot of problems with them. She mentions Fight the New Drug. Again, I think the 4 of us wrote an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune about that, and I'll link to that. She mentions, of course, all kinds of resources that are very much part of the addiction model. So, but to your point, Kristin Hodson, it's not like there's a lot of alternatives out there. So that's a problem that I think we are willing to concede. It's not like there's a system that's out there to address all these complexities that we've been talking about in a very neat, tidy fashion, like the addiction model is able to offer. So yeah.
I would add another bullet point of talk about healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, boundaries, and consent. There is an alternative in terms of how we talk about sexuality. So often within our church, we pluck pornography out of healthy sexuality and healthy relationships instead of talk about all those things and plug pornography in and put it into a context. Additionally, as a mom, talking to the youth, this is where I diverge and I pull in my parental. This is a consent issue. If a bishop is going to talk to my kids on the dangers of pornography and masturbation, those are sexual issues. And I should have an opportunity as a parent to consent to that, especially because it's going to come with the values attached to that. But I think what you said, the how to make a difference, I don't see anything on healthy sexuality. We don't have a baseline first. That to me is very important instead of just looking at pornography. Pornography is in context of a much bigger discussion that can be had. There is resources, there are materials that can happen.
One of those materials is used by the Unitarian Church, OWL, OWL. We can link to that.
Our whole life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's now, keep in mind, that is a very liberal, while it's religious, it would be liberal to LDS standards. But there are a lot of materials, or there could be individual lessons that could be discussed. Just doing healthy relationships would be a great place to start, and boundaries and consent.
I really like that, Kristin. I think just to go off of something you said a lot earlier, couples just having conversations ahead of time about this, about sex, about what is infidelity, because I think so oftentimes we come from a similar background and religious background, you assume, okay, we have the same values, we have the same belief system, we're on the same page with everything, when in fact we enter into these marriages, and these clients enter into these marriages and find out they were not on the same page with a lot of things. So opening up these conversations ahead of time, before the problem really arises. And then I think she mentioned in the article or on the podcast how her husband, this started very early on, and I think she cites some of the stats and Fight the New Drug, but the average age of when kids start looking at pornography, and it is a huge piece of it is because of curiosity, and they're not getting any framework for healthy sexuality to kind of combat that. So I totally agree with you.
Again, speaking to people who might be hearing us for the first time, one of the reasons we get a wee bit energetic about this is how, in talking with so many people, that this topic has affected their lives, and reading the research and really doing everything we can to be able to provide the best information for those that we work with. Until there is even a little bit of an increase of information available and emphasized, like Kristin just pointed out, the healthy boundaries, relationships, negotiating desire, consent, even having hard conversations, and even informing people about how normal that is, that's not an indication that something is wrong or unhealthy. That's just part of a relationship. Until we start seeing some of that, it's these bullet points that she listed, while I see where she's coming from, we have to have some more information on those other topics. Otherwise, it feels like it's just going to keep repeating a cycle of misinformation, fear, and not providing anywhere to go with it. We have to give people ideas of where to go from here, not just fear.
Exactly. More tools, more resources.
Yeah, I like all of that. I mean, having Fit Sunday lessons on healthy sexuality, I think is a great idea. At the same time, it always makes me nervous because there's so much opportunity for morality-based sexual education to, albeit with great intentions, be really misinformed. And so if you're going to do something like that, could you look into finding somebody who's actually trained in your community, who's willing to come in and volunteer an hour of their time, and not have it be a sex addiction trained therapist who are usually not very well trained in sexuality. And we'll link to things like asec.org, where there's usually people in most communities who have been trained in sexuality and would be willing to do something like that, and would be very willing, even if they're not LDS themselves, to, present information in a way that would be comfortable with people's value systems. And talk to the youth. Again, absolutely. I love Kristin Hodson's point that don't just assume you can do that. These are minors, and this is sexual education. And albeit the LDS population in general is usually uncomfortable with professionals talking to kids, I'm very uncomfortable with lay religious people talking to my kids about sexuality. So let's, have appropriate boundaries there. And again, make sure that they're getting appropriate information. Part of why the four of us are very concerned about the approach of Fight the New Drug and Sons of Helaman and some of these other groups that, again, have a very large moral overlay. It's not that you aren't allowed your values. You can have as many values as you want around these issues, but giving your kids misinformation, like that their brains are going to change and that their relationship skills are going to diminish, and most of that very fear-based and very behavioral accountable, and not allowing for normative sexual exploration. And even if it goes against your values, we all know that people need to make their own mistakes and kind of figure out their own ways and beliefs. That is oftentimes the bigger problem. And we're seeing a lot of research coming out from different sources. One right from BYU, where religiosity does make a difference in these cases. where it has an impact on how people see themselves and how they're able to have conversations around their own sexuality, their own sexual behaviors, and how they see themselves. So these things matter. And again, what's so tragic for me is that it's not that we make these mistakes because people are mean or stupid or wanting to hurt people. In fact, it's exactly the opposite, right? The whole reason why there's this fear and frenzy and all this attention is because we're worried and we want people to have good sex lives. We want people to have good relationships. We want people to succeed in this very important part of their lives. And I think that's why it's so tragic for me, because I understand where this is coming from. Talk to the sisters for sure. Talk to the brothers. Don't assume this is gender specific, and educate yourself. Absolutely. And I know I'm biased, but I've got lots of great people on my podcast. I've got lots of, I have been so diligent about trying to get many different perspectives on this that would really be helpful for people. So it's a good place to start is Mormon Mental Health, Mormon Sex Info. There's lots of good professionals that we refer to, and lots of great people on the Mormon Mental Health Association that people can refer to and see that are sex positive and very culturally competent and are not going to challenge values or things of that nature. So any other thoughts about resources or advice?
I will say, for those that are interested and they're curious, again, when I was just presented with the sex addiction model, and then I started to question it and started to really doubt what was going on. David Lay's book, The Myth of Sex Addiction, or Marty Klein, his Porn, Her Pain, could potentially invite you to look at the other side of it. They're not just within Mormonism, but there are two big schools of thought around the approach to out of control sexual behavior. And you have the addiction model on the other side, which is the out of control sexual behavior. And so if you're curious about that, if you're a wife and you've connected with something, or you're curious, or you're just wanting, you may read these other books and still stay planted where you are. That's wonderful. But those are some resources that if you want to balance out the discussion around sexual addiction, David Lay's book, The Myth of Sex Addiction, I highly recommend.
And I interviewed David Lay, still trying to get Marty Klein. So
Natasha, here's going to be a shameless plug. You can potentially set up an interview with him at the Rocky Mountain Sex and Intimacy Summit.
Yeah, no, that's not a shameless plug at all. That's a very valuable plug.
So yeah, you can get Marty Klein and Alan Macchio, who's a sex educator, Tina Sellers, who's going to talk about sexual shame. So maybe you could grab them there.
No, that's another great resource that will be happening in the Salt Lake City area. We'll definitely link to that as well. Great. Well, is there anything that we haven't covered? I know that several of us did listen to the podcast as well, the podcast interview. Was there anything that you feel like we want to make sure we give airtime to as far as either counters or things we agreed with?
Natasha, I will say I've got a couple thoughts. My first thought is I understand that we are complicating the heck out of a topic that a lot of people want to be very simple. And I get that. Trust me, I try myself to simplify it because it just hurts my brain at times. But the more I've studied this, the more I work with people day in and day out, hour after hour, it becomes so clear to me that we cannot continue oversimplifying an inherently complicated topic, whether we're talking about biological questions or socially constructed ideas. I don't care. It is all of the above, and it's really complicated. And the sooner we move toward accepting that and understanding that and seeking to understand each other and not pathologize or categorize people into categories based on a sexual desire, I think our culture is going to just really start to excel, and we'll experience better relationships and better sense of self and, self-esteem, everything, all good things, but not without some pretty difficult conversations and grappling that we're still all untangling from a lot of crap from the past. So yeah, I have so much empathy for her. And I hope that if she were to ever listen to this, I mean, she's heavily on my mind, the woman who wrote this, but I can see so many of the clients that I've worked with having written something so similar, and any energy that may have come through on my end from this podcast I just want to say up front, is 100% because of all the stories that I've heard, and because of how many hours I sat with people that are hurting from this type of narrative, or the narrative that influenced her to write this, not because of what she wrote. And so I just wanted to say that. So thank you for inviting me on tonight.
Thank you, Kristin. Anybody else with closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to touch on that a little bit more too. I think that it's just because of the backlash we've had in the past. I think it's so important to reiterate that we don't discount in any way her experience or the pain that she's gone through and the struggles with this. It can be very, very difficult for individuals and for couples, and clearly you can see in her writings and on the podcast when you listen to it, just the pain that she's gone through. And I want to make sure that she knows, if she was listening or anyone else listening, that we don't discount that or take away from that in any way, and that we do understand how serious this can be for people. And that's all. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
My voice is just going down the tube, so I think you and Shannon and Kristin said it well, and I agree with everything and second it all.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, especially because I know you weren't feeling very well, but I especially appreciated your willingness and your vulnerability to share some personal information as well that you've lived through in your own relationship. And so it's kind of a dual perspective that we got from you tonight, and I felt that was really important. So I didn't let you off the hook, even though I'm sure you'd rather be in bed tonight.
No, thank you for letting me be on it. I always love being on with all of you.
Yeah.
Your perspective is invaluable, Kristin. I just want to say thank you for powering through as well.
Oh, thanks.
And I want to second or third or whatever we're doing here, that pain is real, pain is valid. We all experience things in different ways for all kinds of valid reasons. What we're doing here tonight is not trying to challenge pain. It's more of trying to just challenge perspectives and outlooks for hopefully being able to offer even better services or better ways of knowing how to handle these painful situations. And that's it, really. I mean, I hope that we've been very clear in that, and that pain is actually is supposed to be a part of this type of scenario, that we're not expecting anybody to just not have any feelings around these types of issues. These are really delicate, sacred, intense, personal issues, often for a variety of reasons. And we all have a right to that. So thank you all for coming on. And like I said, I hope to have this panel of discussion more with people who've experienced this scenario, probably hopefully in the next few weeks, not more than a few months at the longest. And would love to hear people's comments. Feel free to share your own experiences. If you find these types of podcasts useful, please consider donating to the Open Stories Foundation. This is not done without any cost or energy on the part of many people. And we just, again, thank you all for either listening or being my guest tonight.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
We took the long road home turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.